Good afternoon. Welcome to World Denver's virtual speaker program. My name is Lauren Ozga. I'm the Director of Development and Communications here at World Denver, and I also serve on the board of our event partner, Denver Sister Cities International. We're also glad to be joined today by Aurora Sister Cities, and I'd like to thank our partners and all of you for tuning in to this important conversation today. If you're new here, World Denver is an organization that facilitates international exchange and global engagement in the Denver region, and we're continuing these opportunities for our community in the virtual space just a short while longer. So keep an eye out for opportunities to safely gather in the near future. We're honored today to hear from Emily White, who is based at the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa, in conversation with Chuck Creeman, chair of the Axum committee with Denver Sister Cities. We want this to be an interactive conversation, so please feel free to submit any questions you have at any time throughout the program for our speaker into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First, I'd like to welcome Carlin Shorb, CEO of Aurora Sister Cities International, to share a bit about their sister city, Adama, in Ethiopia. And then we'll go to Chuck with Denver Sister Cities to kick off the conversation with Emily.
Thank you so much, Lauren. As Lauren mentioned, my name is Carlin Shorb. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit organization called Aurora Sister Cities International. As you might imagine, we facilitate sister relationships and partnerships between the city of Aurora, Colorado, and other cities abroad. One of our most well-established sister relationships is with a city called Adama, Ethiopia. It's a city that is approximately 90 kilometers outside of Ethiopia's capital of Addis Ababa. It is a rapidly growing city. I'm not sure the last time, I think probably 2007 and 2008 was the last time they had an urban study to show what their population is, but it's a city that's eventually going to grow into the capital city of Addis Ababa and become one of its larger suburbs. The sister relationship was founded in 2014. And I don't actually have a lot to share about our sister relationship at the moment because this is somewhat of a precursor of what our speakers will discuss. But one of the experiences we've found or had in the last 2 years has actually been our inability to communicate on a regular basis, if at all, in the last year with our partners in Adama as a result of some of the conflicts, I believe, that are going on there. So it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be a part of this. Thank you to World Denver and to Denver Sister Cities for inviting us to be a part of this. I will introduce our facilitator, Chuck Creeman. Just very briefly, Chuck is the chair of the Denver Sister Cities Committee. And his first experience with Ethiopia came as a Peace Corps volunteer. And he's had a lifelong passion for working with the Ethiopian community here and with Ethiopia abroad. He has also spent a career working for housing and urban development. And so without further ado, I will introduce Chuck.
All right. Thank you, Carlin. And thanks to World Denver for organizing this important event. I'm kind of honored to be selected to moderate this event, and thanks to all of us who have joined us. We're fortunate to have with us Emily White, Regional Refugee Coordinator for the Horn of Africa, who's stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa. Since you've had the opportunity to read her biography on the World Denver webpage when you signed up, I won't take a lot of time to repeat that information, just to mention that Emily has been with the State Department for over 10 years. She has an academic background in anthropology and law, and probably best of all, she's a Denver native. We'll begin our program with some opening remarks from Emily. If you want to sign on and join us visually and audially. Good evening in Addis Ababa, where it's just after 9 or 10.
Yeah, that's right. It's just after 9 p.m. here in Addis. Yep.
Yeah, we mess you up with daylight savings time.
Well, thank you so much, Chuck, for the introduction. Thank you to the whole World Denver family. Thank you, Carlin, as well, for helping to facilitate this event. We always love the opportunity to reach out to people domestically in the United States and talk to them more about our work over here abroad. It really helps, I think, to gain a better understanding of U.S. foreign policy priorities and the kind of work that diplomats are doing on behalf of the U.S. people all around the world. As mentioned, I'm a 10-year veteran of the State Department now. I've been covering the Horn of Africa for the last year. I'm based here at our embassy in Addis Ababa. I'm with PRM, which is the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And PRM is the Humanitarian Bureau of the State Department. We manage about $3 billion annually in humanitarian assistance worldwide. And here, specific to the Horn of Africa, we manage a portfolio of about $200 million, which includes USG humanitarian assistance here in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Sudan, and South Sudan. I cover Eritrea as well, although currently we have no foreign assistance programs in Eritrea. People often think of USAID as the humanitarian part of the US government, and that's right. USAID is a big part of our humanitarian efforts, but PRM is the part of the State Department that sort of mirrors USAID, and PRM has the lead on issues related to refugees and migration, and we manage our humanitarian diplomacy efforts with the State Department as well. I believe many joining us this afternoon have a strong connection to Ethiopia. I know Chuck was a Peace Corps volunteer there. Others have had experiences living or working in Ethiopia. So you know it's rich history, culturally a very vibrant place. However, Ethiopia is now racked by intercommunal violence that threatens to undermine the national unity and to really destabilize the larger Horn of Africa. And in particular, we have grave concern about the crisis in Tigray, and that's really been the focus of most of my efforts here in Ethiopia since I came onto the position. The violence across Tigray is horrifying. It shocks the conscience. It all started in November when the government began what it termed a law enforcement operation against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which allegedly attacked a military installation. The TPLF, as it's known, had previously ruled over the country for 27 years and also committed some grave human rights violations and abuses in the time that it was in power as well. The government hoped for a quick win, and evidently it looks as though it was hoping for the quick win with the support of a former foe, now turned friend, which is Eritrea, the neighbor to the north. Ethiopia and Eritrea were involved in a long civil war, a long war for many years, which came to a peaceful end in 2018, which is at the time that Prime Minister Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to bring that conflict to an end. And it appears to all watchers that Eritrea forces did come in and have continued to be involved in what has gone on in Tigray and indeed responsible for human rights violations and abuses themselves. Over 6 months later, the humanitarian toll has been absolutely devastating. Of the 6 million people in Tigray, estimates are that about 5.2 million of them, or 91% of them, are in need of emergency food assistance. And the UN has warned of the real risk of famine in some areas for the first time since the 1980s. Thousands have died, but it's really impossible to assess how many because there's been real access issues and being able to gain access to parts of Tigray, both due to administrative hurdles, security impediments, the volatile situation on the ground. It's been a difficult situation to really get clarity on what is exactly happening because access has not been sort of full and unfettered over the course of the conflict. There's been over 63,000 refugees from Tigray who have been displaced to Sudan since the conflict began. 2 refugee camps that were hosting Eritrean refugees very close to the Eritrean border have been destroyed. There have been many reports of forced deportation of those refugees, violence against refugees, and unfortunately, these acts committed by the very people who these refugees fled from in the country where they sought refuge. So very difficult and distressing situation for the Eritrean refugees here in Ethiopia. There have been close to 2 million people displaced internally across Tigray. Now that's about 2 million out of 6 million. So about a third of everybody who was living in Tigray before the conflict have been internally displaced, forced from their homes, living in hiding with friends, relatives, informal IDP sites without many times access to basic life-saving services, very difficult to get health services, food is difficult, water, hygiene issues. I visited an IDP site in Mekelle, which is the capital of Tigray, a few weeks back. And just to mention one woman who I met there, she has a master's degree. She was a teacher. She speaks perfect English. She had been living in Tigray, and then in November, she was forced to flee her home. She was 9 months pregnant at the time, had 2 other smaller children. On her way walking to Mekelle over hundreds of kilometers, gave birth to her 3rd child in what she called in the woods, and then was living in an IDP site in Mekelle, an informal site, which is a former school, which had, at times 30, 40, 50 people in one single classroom, sleeping on the floor, babies, pregnant women, lots of children. It's really a pretty depressing and distressing situation. Even in that site in Mekelle, they hadn't seen formal food assistance in the time that they had been there. So they were entirely surviving on donations from the host communities. So there was one room with just stacks of injera and giant pots of lentils, which were basically sustaining the 3,000 people living at this particular IDP site. As even in Mekelle, even in the capital city of Tigray, the one where there's most humanitarian access, they hadn't received food distributions there as well. And these stories go on and if you're as seized with this crisis as I am and are following the news articles coming out as closely as I am, every day there's a litany of abuses, of trauma, of suffering, widespread gender-based violence and rape, really horrific attacks being reported, and it's really quite distressing. As you can imagine, the need for mental health and psychosocial services and trauma counseling is just immense, because the things that people have suffered are just incredibly horrifying. There have been 9 humanitarian workers killed thus far as well. So even people who are there to help and are unarmed have been targeted in some instances, and in some instances targeted specifically because they are humanitarian workers, which is of course of great concern and can potentially have a chilling effect on the much needed scale up for the humanitarian response in Tigray. And UNICEF issued a report yesterday indicating that they alone have registered over 6,000 unaccompanied and separated children. So these are children who aren't sure where their family members are, aren't sure where their parents are, and are living in limbo. And UNICEF and others are trying to help them be connected to their family members where possible, although in some instances it might be that their parents are impossible to locate. The United States has been quite vocal in condemning in the strongest terms the brutal killings, the sexual violence, the forced removals, wanton destruction of civilian property. President Biden issued a statement this week on this issue, and others have also issued similarly strong statements and condemnation. Secretary Blinken, USAID Ambassador Samantha Power has been seized with this issue as well, and is very vocal in calling for cessation of hostilities, unimpeded, unfettered humanitarian access. We've condemned the human rights violations and abuses, the atrocities, and they've likely been committed by all armed actors to the conflict, which includes the TPLF and the Ethiopian army and the Eritrean army and the Amhara regional forces. I mean, there's a lot of people operating in this space, which makes it particularly volatile and also particularly difficult to sort of piece apart who's responsible for what. In our assessment in recent weeks, the security situation has certainly worsened, exacerbating the dire humanitarian crisis and hindering the response. So we keep waiting for, sort of an opening or things to start to improve, but unfortunately it hasn't trended that way over the last few weeks. We've called for an immediate ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian access, protection of civilians, withdrawal of Eritrean forces, an independent international investigation into what's gone on in Tigray and to the human rights abuses and atrocities, and accountability for those responsible. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is actually a pretty independent and well-run organization, and they're partnering with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights on an investigation. They're on the ground now. We hope to hear more from them in the coming months. And we're actively coordinating with like-minded partners. I mean, the amount of diplomacy going on this issue is immense, with regional governments, with the African Union, pressed for greater action in the United Nations, both in the Security Council and the Human Rights Council, which is meeting in June, later on this month. And we've engaged at the highest level of the Ethiopian and Eritrean government to press to an end to hostilities as well. We've taken more material action recently, restricting certain pots of assistance that doesn't apply to humanitarian assistance, but security assistance and other programming is on pause. We've implemented or are in the process of implementing targeted visa restrictions on individuals who have been deemed to have impeded the resolution of the crisis or who are blocking humanitarian access. And we're also giving generally to the humanitarian response. We've committed, as the United States, over 300 million in humanitarian assistance in Tigray. This is combined between USAID and PRM, the State Department. A very large chunk of that is going straight to food assistance and to our partner, the WFP, or the World Food Program, and then also to protection activities, mental health counseling, building formal IDP sites, GBV referral and counseling services. We're providing enough food to feed 4 million people, but getting that food into the right hands continues to be a challenge. And meanwhile, this is not the only conflict brewing in Ethiopia. There's other hotspots of violence across the country. There are attacks on ethnic Amharans and Gumus in the Benishangul Gumuz region. Ethnic Oromo and Amharans living in Oromia faced attacks. There's violence between people in the Afar and Somali regions, and then conflicts unfolding in the southern nations, nationalities, and peoples regions. So really everywhere you look in this country, there are hotspots. And I think one thing that we sometimes get concerned about is the amount of attention being paid to Tigray, which of course is deserved, but there are similarly severe humanitarian crises or concerns in other parts of this country as well that also I think require attention. Ethiopia is also the third largest host of refugees in Africa. So there's sizable populations here of refugees from South Sudan, Somalia, and Eritrea. So even though the Eritrean refugees, I think, have had a difficult run of it in the last 4 months and will continue to have difficulties here, there's still over 800,000 refugees total here in Ethiopia. And in many places, Ethiopia is a generous host to refugees here. And, Ethiopia really is at a turning point. There's a national election set for June 21st, which will really sort of be a test of Prime Minister Abiy. There's questions about those elections, given the widespread insecurity, the displacement, the logistical challenges in putting together an election in a country of 110 million people without a strong democratic history. And then, of course, you look around the region. South Sudan, the neighbor to the west, continues to see huge humanitarian needs, internal displacement and displacement across borders. South Sudan's facing one of the most severe food crises on this planet, with many people also at risk of famine. It's also one of the most dangerous places for humanitarian workers. We see all too often reports of attacks on humanitarian convoys or staff. and major issues with accountability and governance that make it hard for the government to really respond to those issues. Sudan, similarly, the issues in Darfur are flaring up again. There was a governmental transition in Sudan over the last couple of years, which has led to a lot of change and a lot of hope, but has also unleashed some ugliness, which we're seeing in different parts of Sudan as well. And there's great tensions between Sudan and Ethiopia around the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD, which is on the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. There's also an ongoing border dispute about a small sliver of land on the border, which could lead to more militarization and greater conflict there. So, you know, the Horn is a volatile place. I haven't even touched on Somalia. That's not part of my portfolio, but it's absolutely part of the puzzle, sort of lurking in the background in a place that requires great focus and attention due to the growing threat of Al-Shabaab, the need to counter violent extremism, and the more instability there is in the region, the more room there is for disruptive actors to operate and to wreak havoc. Ethiopia has been the linchpin in ensuring regional security, but now that's obviously in jeopardy as there's even greater instability and volatility. So that's all. I'll wrap it up there. That was a lot, but happy to take any questions and look forward to our conversation, Chuck.
Thank you very much, Emily. Let me delve a little more deeply into some of these issues. So tell us about your awareness of the NGO. So it's an acronym I hope the audience understands, for non-governmental organizations. Which ones do you work with, are you aware of, and what do you hear from them about their ability to operate essentially in Tigray, but perhaps in other parts of Ethiopia where their work is going on?
Great. So the two main NGO partners that PRM has operating specifically in Tigray are the International Rescue Committee, or IRC, which provides water services, GBV referral services, child protection services, and then another US-based NGO called the Center for Victims of Torture, which provides mental health and psychosocial services. Now, these are two NGOs that PRM was partnering with in the Eritrean refugee camps in Tigray before the conflict began. But obviously their work has become more important now than ever, and they're both pivoting their work away a bit from the refugee focus and towards internally displaced persons, given the IDP crisis that we're seeing across the region. And so given that there's close to 2 million people we estimate to be displaced, both of them are starting and aiming to provide more services to those people. Now, this is not without its challenges. And indeed, we receive reports on a daily basis about humanitarian workers getting stopped at certain checkpoints, unable to access certain roads because there's ongoing fighting, being threatened with guns. There have been humanitarian workers killed as well. REST is an NGO that operates here that's a major partner of USAID, and REST is very much involved in food distribution across Tigray. And a couple of weeks ago, a national staff member for REST, so an Ethiopian of Tigrayan origin, was killed in Tigray during a food distribution. So targeted because he was a humanitarian worker, was working for an NGO on this effort, and seen as a traitor to Ethiopians. So you hear a lot of those kind of incidents. The Danish Refugee Council, or DRC, is also very active here, as is the Norwegian Refugee Council. And both are also PRM partners, but not specifically in the Tigray region. And both are really trying to scale up what we call protection activities. I mean, I think what we see as one of the major gaps is on the issue of GBV, on making sure that survivors and victims are able to receive the counseling services and health services that they need, because the reports are just staggering about what kind of gender-based violence is coming out of the region. And so how do we locate the people who have been affected by that, and how do we ensure that they get adequate services? So that's been a major concern. I think the other organization that I really want to flag is MSF, or as it's known in English, Doctor Without Borders. It operates much differently than other NGOs. It doesn't see itself under the same sort of set of constraints. It's often more flexible and agile. And certainly in the early days of the conflict, they had more access than anyone else. And it's sort of because their creative ways of working. Some might say they push the boundaries too far, but I think MSF would take the position that it's doing what it needs to do to be where people need it the most. And it really has done a commendable effort, particularly on the health side, in making sure that there are health facilities that are operating. MSF has also done really important work in documenting the destruction to health facilities across Tigray, which has just been staggering. I forget the exact numbers, but one report suggested that of 108 health facilities, something like 80 of them had been destroyed, and so and if not destroyed, looted. And it's really systematic looting, like going into facilities and tearing apart binders, trashing surgical rooms. It's not even looting just to steal or to take, it's to destroy. And I think that's been one of the most disturbing things we've seen. But MSF has done some pretty laudable work and has gone more places than anyone else.
So what do you know about the rural areas? I mean, what we hear is that the more active NGOs and the UN is working along the main road, and Mekelle is in the east, Adigrat, Shire, Adwa, Axum, sort of the main spine road across Ethiopia, Tigray, from east to west. But we have friends with family up in Ramah, which is up where near where the Eritrean refugee camps were. I believe they used to have a clinic and an ambulance that would enable people to be transported down to Adwa for more advanced medical facilities. So what do we know about what's happening outside of the urban centers, which I guess are now overburdened with, and some of you may not be familiar with the acronym IDP, stands for internally displaced person. They're not refugees outside of, from an outside country, but they are internally displaced. So talk a little bit about what reports, what you hear secondhand from the NGOs and the others that you consult with and work with over time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge question, and the question that we're all trying to answer. I mean, the truth of the matter is that we don't really know. I mean, that there just has not been the ability to access a lot of the rural areas outside of the main highway, which you very succinctly laid out, that connects Mekelle to Shire through the other cities on the northern corridor. Getting out of those rural areas has been really tough, and there have been a few reasons for that. One is there's just ongoing conflict in some of those areas, and so there have been NGOs who on the road are turned around and said, sorry, there's shelling, you can't go there. And no NGO which has a duty of care to its staff is going to go into an active conflict zone while it's ongoing. That's just, it's a difficult thing to do. So there's that issue. There's the issue of satellite communications, which has been a huge issue that we've attacked in our advocacy as well, because NGOs have been limited in their ability to import new VSATs or satellite phones into Ethiopia. And again, a satellite phone is a key tool for an NGO seeking to go outside of urban areas and into rural areas. And so many NGOs don't have sufficient or the right kind of communications equipment that allows them to go outside of an urban area. I mean, if you're in a rural area, there's a car accident, you're whatever it may be, or there's somebody who's injured and you have no ability to communicate outside of where you are to get help. Again, it's a major risk for NGOs. And so without the ability to import satellite equipment, there's been many NGOs who have been unwilling, and UN agencies as well, to be sure, who have been unwilling to travel too far off of the main arteries. So that leaves a major gap in our understanding of what's going on. What we are hearing through the information that is trickling out in this largely comes from firsthand accounts of people who are in those rural areas that are arriving in Adigrat, in Axum, in Ottawa, in Mekelle, and talking about what they see are people in hiding, people scared, lack of access to food, facilities destroyed. I mean, it just sounds extremely grim, but exactly what is the extent of the destruction is really hard to say, because neither the UN nor NGOs nor the international community has been able to access many of the rural areas. So the reports we're getting are pretty bleak, but it's hard to lay eyes on those areas to do really thorough assessments.
So going from the frying pan to the fire, what has been the complications that the COVID epidemic has created, and what do you see as the impact generally of COVID? Any effective response to COVID being stymied by the conflict situation, which probably goes without saying?
Yeah, I mean, what COVID? I mean, when you go to Mekelle, it's sort of what it feels like. Oh, what COVID, right? I mean, it doesn't even register, I think, as something that people are focused on outside of the internationals, right? Who will wear masks, but beyond that, nobody else is. I mean, you go into an IDP site, it's extremely congested, as I mentioned. 5,000 people living in a primary school site, designated for a couple hundred kids, sharing 4 latrines, right? I mean, it's the sanitation situation is so bleak and so severe that I don't think COVID is really a consideration. That being said, it is absolutely there, and in some estimations is running rampant. We track very closely COVID rates across Ethiopia, and Tigray stopped reporting in November, but then again started reporting about 6 weeks ago. And the positivity rate that they're reporting is about, last I saw, was over 40%. So COVID is absolutely there, but it's just really hard to tell sort of what impact it's having. I mean, hospitals and what limited health facilities there are already, sort of straining under the weight of the injured, the sick, the crippled that are coming through their doors. So it's hard to tell exactly sort of what impact COVID has had. That being said, I will say UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that is one of our main partners, and their staff in Tigray has been affected by COVID, and their senior officer there was medevaced out of Mekelle a couple weeks back because he contracted COVID there. So it's absolutely there. It's absolutely affecting, I think, the humanitarian response. But it's hard to figure out, what does mitigation look like? What does a good COVID strategy look like in conditions that are so dire?
Well, it's hard to be positive, but I know many of the people who are on this call and joining us on Zoom care about the conditions, are concerned, and struggle. How can I help? And we've reached out to a number of the NGOs you've mentioned, the MSF and the International Rescue Committee, among others. Also, Save the Children. What advice for those of us who say, how can we help? What can you share with us about the best way we can do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I obviously in my position can't advocate for giving to any certain NGO or organization. But I will say writ large that the NGOs responding in this crisis do need more resources and do need more support to tackle, sort of the immense needs on the ground. I've mentioned food, GBV, mental health and psychosocial services, health services, child protection services. So there are a lot of international NGOs operating in those spaces that are really trying to scale up, but absolutely need more resources to do so. And so, looking into what organizations are operating there and seem to have a good track record. And I will say Ethiopia is not the easiest place for NGOs to operate. So finding organizations that do have a history in Ethiopia, do have a history perhaps even in Tigray in specific, is really a good step forward. I mean, I think part of the problem with the humanitarian response here in Ethiopia is that Ethiopia had transitioned to more of a development assistance country. And so most of the NGOs and many of the agencies here were really focused more on development work instead of emergency humanitarian crisis work. And they're different types of work, right? And they require different kinds of expertise. They require different kinds of structures within organizations. And so this crisis, which I think took many people by surprise, if not everyone, I think has been a challenge for the humanitarian community here to pivot away from the development mindset and to sort of move into the humanitarian emergency response mindset, which is required to respond in this kind of environment. There's something we call civ-mil coordination, and that's coordinating between civilian and military entities. And in a place like Tigray, that's so important, right? Like organizations need to be able to know what to do when they hit a military checkpoint, know how to engage in a place where there is active and ongoing conflict. And not all organizations are able to do that or comfortable doing that. And so long as the conflict is ongoing, organizations that have the capacity to respond in those kind of high stress, high pressure situations, I think are the best bet.
So you mentioned recently that the administration, the President and Secretary of State Blinken announced some limited sanctions to express their continuing concerns that the promised unfettered access has not materialized, that there's there continues to be violence and violence against women and other atrocities reported. Have you seen any effect? And also, those of us who had high hopes when the government change occurred in 2018 and the peaceful situation between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the appointment of a new Supreme Court Justice Ms. Ashanafi gave promise of real reforms. So my question is, how is the government, at least can you share with us what their official line is and any reaction they've had to the American sanctions?
Yeah. So what steps that we are in the process of taking, and I hesitate to call it sanctions because I think that suggests sort of a different bucket of sticks, if you will. But there has been sort of freezing of certain kinds of assistance. So certain pots of money that were designated for Ethiopia, again, not humanitarian assistance, but in other areas, is being scaled back. Now, one reason why that is a little bit of limited effectiveness, in my humble opinion, is that under the previous administration, under President Trump, there was also a pause on assistance. And this was around displeasure around Ethiopia's negotiations on the GERD. So President Trump made a decision that wanted to put more pressure on Ethiopia on the GERD negotiations, and so put in place a pause on funding. Now, that stream of funding then, or some of those buckets of funding, had recently been reopened in the new administration and now are going to be shut again. And so I wonder, and it remains to be seen, what kind of impact or effect will be felt, given that those are some pots of money that have they sort of gotten used to not having here, and so it sort of remains to be seen if that will have effect. The limited visa restrictions will target specific individuals, and it hasn't been determined exactly who those individuals are or will be, who will have visa restrictions placed on them. Excuse me. That people like to be able to travel to the United States. The Ethiopian diaspora, as many on this call are aware, is big and vibrant. And there's a strong connection between Ethiopia and the United States. And so, and the same is true of Eritrea, which will also be the target of some limited visa restrictions. So to the extent that's a deterrent or changes behavior, remains to be seen. I mean, I will say the public line here, in the press, in the Ethiopian media, the rhetoric that you're hearing out of the government is pretty firm in that they think that that they're handling this well, that there are challenges, that the US and the international community are being unfair, are not providing as much support as we should, that and make points about the TPLF's horrid behavior in the past, and it's now been designated as a terrorist organization under Ethiopian law, and so any talks with TPLF would be talks with terrorists, and they shouldn't be expected to talk with terrorists. And so it's been a difficult patch in the bilateral relationship, I will say. Just this last weekend, there was a big, sort of Ethiopian nationalist rally at at one of the big arenas here, one of the big stadiums, about 25 to 30,000 people. It was sort of had anti-US undertones. Keep your hands off Ethiopia. There was a day of rage that was set up by some members of the diaspora community a few weeks back to express the rage that the United States, Europeans, others in the international community are meddling in the internal affairs of Ethiopia. And so that's really, I think, the main rhetoric is that we've been meddling, we don't understand what they're dealing with. The piece on the Eritrean forces, I think, has been, it's sort of evolved. I mean, I think originally there was no recognition that Eritrean forces were present, and perhaps a denial. And then, it became harder to deny that was the case. I mean, in my own, quick trip to Mekelle, I saw 4 truckloads of Eritrean soldiers there. So, it was just too obvious to continue to deny it. And so then it came to, okay, well, we've talked to Eritrea, we're working out a plan for withdrawal. And, a couple weeks later, here we are still waiting for this withdrawal to happen. And it's a little bit hard to tell too, sort of how much control any one person really has over some of these decisions. So we'll see. But the rhetoric, I think, has been pretty firm and pretty tough, and it has been difficult, I think, for our bilateral relationship.
One of our questioners even indicates some stories of Eritreans bringing in Somali trainees and training Somali forces as part of the effort. Any reports regarding that?
I've seen every news article that's out there that puts, and I think I've seen something along those lines. That's another real problem that we're dealing with is the misinformation and disinformation, and on all sides, right? I mean, I think there's a lot going on all sides, and so sorting through it all to try and figure out what is real and what is not is really, really tough. And social media is just, all over the place. And, we have people at the embassy who their whole job is to track social media, to try and see sort of what people are saying and try and figure out, what's real and what's not. And, I mean, we know from our own country, sort of the sort of dizzying effect that can have in sowing chaos or discontent. And so, yeah, it's hard to say. I've seen, similar things like that, but it's really hard to say. There was a report a couple of weeks ago of white phosphorus being used in Tigray, which if true, if that was used against civilians, would be a war crime. But we have spent a lot of time trying to figure out, sort of where the ground truth is on this and many other issues, and it's hard to say where any of it lies. But we're looking into all of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thinking a little, stepping back from the immediate to a little more long range. First of all, is there you mentioned a lot of different organizations, UN organizations, non-governmental organizations, other international workers, international governments. Is there any kind of formal coordinating committee that you work through or work with?
Yeah, there
is. Try
is.
and rationalize how all this assistance, how to respond appropriately?
Yeah. And so the main coordination mechanism is through OCHA. So OCHA is the United Nations Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs. And so that is the formal coordination structure. They convene regular meetings. They coordinate both within the UN agencies and then with NGOs. But there's a lot of actors in this space. And so getting sort of consistent messaging, consistent advocacy, I think has been tough. And I, to be frank, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I think this really caught people by surprise. And I'm not sure that NGOs and perhaps UN agencies here as well were quite as had as much expertise on crisis operations as one might wish in going into a crisis response. And so I think there were, at the beginning, a lot of questions about that coordination and how effective it was, because it really is important to speak with a unified voice from the humanitarian community on these issues. And that's hard, sometimes that's like herding cats, but there are certain baseline messages that I think we can all agree on. And so being really, really in lockstep on those messages is something that I think OCHA has tried to do. There's also humanitarian donor coordination mechanisms as well. And so those are all the other countries here that have, that offer humanitarian assistance. The members of the embassy get together to talk about, sort of what they're seeing, compare notes, develop joint advocacy messages, write tweets. I'm on a WhatsApp group of humanitarian donors. And today it was all the back and forth about the wording on a specific tweet that would come out after a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister today. So, it's there's a lot of coordination, but there's also a lot of actors. And so it's hard to always make sure everyone is fully lined up.
Yeah. Which Ethiopian ministries, agencies, organizations do you have interactions with most frequently?
Yeah, so I mean, the main one that's focused on that sort of covers the humanitarian affairs, for instance, for internally displaced persons, is the Ministry of Peace. And the Ministry of Peace sort of governs, sort of many pieces of the humanitarian puzzle. I believe they oversee the National Disaster Risk Management Commission, or NDRMC, which is the more sort of operational on the ground agency within the government of Ethiopia that does, sort of emergency crisis response work, and is also, sort of part of this effort as we develop strategies and solutions for displaced persons. I mean, they can't stay in schools forever, right? I mean, schools are ready to reopen. There's huge pressure from the government to move people outside of schools. And so then where do they go, right? They still can't go back to where they came from. And so, there's a whole effort underway to develop sites, IDP camps, where people then will live. And NDRMC is sort of the main entity helping to coordinate on that. There's the Bureau of Labor and Social Affairs, or BOLSA, which is also on the ground, which we interact with. And then on the refugee side, there's something called ARA, which is the Agency for Refugee and Returnee Affairs. And they're the ones who sort of cover all issues that touch on and relate to refugees. So that's really my main government interlocutor as we look at, the displacement of Eritrean refugees across Tigray, as 32,000 people living in 2 camps now have no home. And so where are those people? What's happened to them? What kind of services are available to them is something we're very much actively trying to figure out.
So you're stationed in Addis Ababa, and I don't know if you had any chance to interact with any of the visiting people who have come to Ethiopia, Special Envoy Feltman, who visited there. But as being a veteran of large organizations, there's always a differing in perspective between people on the ground like yourself and the headquarters operation. So I don't know if the State Department is listening in, but
yeah,
if you were to try and remind them of the realities in the field, what are some of the main points you'd want to impress that they remain aware of as they do their headquarters function?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an excellent question, and something we talk a lot about, because there is, there is a disconnect between, and this is not just in this context, this is at embassies around the world. I mean, there's sort of the reality at Post and the reality in DC. And at the end of the day, the policy is made in Washington, DC, right? And that's where the decisions are made. And we do the best that we can to inform and to provide advice and opinions. But at the end of the day, we're not the ones calling the shots, which is fine. And that's as it, should be.
40 bottoms for nothing. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I guess, to be totally honest, I mean, I think, and I'm not saying this is a criticism, but I'm saying this is something we really need to think about is, and this is coming from a humanitarian point of view, right? Which is what I look after, right? That's my portfolio. And so, we need to be condemning the atrocities. We need to be loud. We need to be vocal. Like, we cannot be silent in the face of that. My deep concern, and I'm not saying this will bear itself out, but we'll see, is that leads to an entrenchment of position on this side and a hardening of position that then could perhaps have worse humanitarian consequences, right? And so what's the right balance of that is something that I think we are actively grappling with and discussing. And it's hard to figure out exactly how you get that right. Because yes, we need to be loud and vocal. And I fully support all the statements we've made along those lines. And, we need to take strong action. But I think we also need to be mindful of what the potential consequences are of that on the humanitarian side. And if there are people, more people who will be in suffering as a result of that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest piece that I wonder about.
Well,
and one other thing, I'm sorry to interrupt you. One other thing that I think that, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is I think here on the ground in Ethiopia, one thing we're really trying to do is make sure that our colleagues back in Washington and others understand that this isn't just about Tigray, right? That like all around this country, there are hotspots and areas of conflict, and that we cannot be, we cannot forget about that, or we cannot pay so much attention to Tigray that we can't focus on some of the other areas where there is displacement and violence that also is destabilizing. So I think that's the one other piece, is that everyone has been seized with Tigray, understandably so, but I also hope that's not to the detriment of having sort of a broader view about the context within the country.
A friend of mine did some analysis of the facts that he was able to gather, and there is some cell service periodically between the U.S. and some of the major cities, Ottawa, and some in Axum, more in Mekelle. But looking at the facts as he understands them, and I know you're trained in the law, I don't know if you did international law, but looking at the internationally accepted definition of genocide, his conclusion is that the facts as he saw them met the definition of genocide. And as you were just mentioning, if that were to be more commonly accepted as the face of the situation, what would be the impact? Again, thinking of your humanitarian and refugee perspective, would that be a hindrance or a help in terms of how effective the response could be?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer to that question. I mean, you're right. You're asking exactly the same questions that I think we're asking as well. And I think, the State Department's actively looking at, violations of international humanitarian law. What sort of, does this fit under a definition of genocide or elsewhere? I mean, the Secretary has said that in his assessment, the forced displacement of Tigrayans across Western Tigray does amount to ethnic cleansing. So that is language that our own Secretary has certainly been comfortable using. And then sort of what more and what comes from that, I think is a big question. And I will say, when he did use that term, I do think, we don't use these terms lightly, right? Ethnic cleansing, genocide, whatever it may be, famine, another word that is not used lightly. And so, real thought and lots of long meetings go into making determinations about this kind of phrasing. I mean, you're asking the right question, and I wish I knew the answer, but you know, what, so you call it something, and then what does that mean for the people who have been affected by that? And what does that mean in terms of what kind of accountability we might see? I think is a huge question. You know, I mentioned earlier that there is this investigation going into human rights abuses being conducted by the Ethiopian Human Rights Council and the OHRC, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. That acronym always gets me. And you know, we have pushed very strongly that investigation needs to be independent, thorough. Those people need to get full access. And it's just sort of starting, and we'll see if that bears out. There have been a couple of examples of EHRC issuing what seem to be pretty independent accounts of what's happened in a few of the places. I mean, you know, we've talked a lot about Axum, but there was an incident in Axum where, depending on who you talk to or which source you talk to, you know, maybe 700 people were killed, maybe 200 people were killed. It's hard to say exactly, but something bad certainly happened in Axum, which of course is, you know, a very important religious center for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And so, you know, to see a place that has been as sort of venerated as Axum be also a target of this violence is just, you know, shocking.
Yeah, it supposedly happened in the churchyard at St. Mary Zion, you know, with the Ark of the Covenant right next door.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So to step back just for a moment, you know, since we don't know when the conflict will subside, when some semblance of normalcy will return, and I guess we're stuck with a humanitarian response for some indefinite period. But knowing that the whole agricultural system has been disrupted, is there anybody with the time or attention to think about, you know, how one might rebuild the agricultural economy of Tigray when the time comes?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, Tigray is an, you know, a huge agricultural center for the country, and so, you know, what effect that will have, and the planting season is now, and you know, we have this huge concern that the planting season will be completely missed, which will then lead to greater food insecurity going forward. And certainly, my colleagues at USAID who work on food issues are very much thinking about this. ICRC, which is the International Committee for the Red Cross, is another major partner of ours in Tigray, and they're doing a big seed distribution program to 16,000 households near Adigrat to try and, you know, help people at least be able to get through this planting season, because the last harvest season was totally missed, and then if you kill this planting season as well, it's just a double whammy. And yes, I mean, I know that with USAID, there is a lot of talk about what does agriculture look like in, you know, sort of in the near and the medium and long term in Tigray. You know, it's still a little early to talk about reconstruction and rehabilitation, but you're right that the agricultural piece is particularly important given the centrality of agricultural to livelihoods across Tigray and really, you know, food supplies across Ethiopia.
Yeah. There may be seeds, but I'm not sure who's there to plant them. We're getting close to the bewitching hour, and Emily, you like some parting thoughts to leave us with?
Well, just really, Chuck, thanks so much. You clearly know the region well, and you know, thanks for the excellent questions. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks again to World Denver. Again, I can't advocate for giving to any particular NGO or giving at all, but this is a real humanitarian crisis, and so you know, the more that people can understand what's going on and the more visibility we get on it, I think the more sort of shocking things we'll see, and the more need there will be for organizations to help scale up the response. But thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Glad to be connected with you all. And you know, if there's anyone interested in continuing these conversations, let me know. I'm happy to share my contact information with World Denver, and we can be in touch.
Lauren?
Yes, thank you so much, Emily and Chuck, for your time and your expertise in this really informative, challenging conversation. I'd also like to thank World Denver board member Michael Zink for connecting us with Emily, and thank our partners again at Denver and Aurora Sister Cities, and to thank all of you for joining us today. We just want to remind you the Axum committee with Denver Sister Cities is raising relief funds, and you can find that link in the chat as well as on the event page for today. We'd like to invite you to the next World Denver virtual speaker series on June 24th with Elena Delosier, who will be breaking down the complex relationships between core actors in the Yemen region. Please visit worlddenver.org for more information on that. Thank you again so much to Emily and Chuck and to all of you for joining us. Take care,
Thank you,
everyone.
World Denver.
Thank you so much.